Today, this is for first year students, is the second complementary activity. For the others, is the first one. So we can say that we are opening this year academic complementaries, having an exceptional speaker. We have a professor in economics by UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles, Hugo Hopenhayn. Then in addition, we had the fortunate to have it with us as visiting professor for 2 months. So as an addition, in order to organize the roundtable, we have Professor Jose Vicente Mora, who is professor of economics in CONEF. He knows very well the research undertaken by Hugo, so he's going to be the one to introduce properly the speaker. I'm just going to say thank you so much to both them for having the opportunity to organize this roundtable about the productivity of nations. You will see that the slides are in Spanish, but the talk would be in English. Okay, so thank you very much, and you're welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, so I'm going to go super fast because it's worth the time to let me talk, not use my time for this. Just to tell you, Hugo is an impressive scholar. We are extremely lucky to have him around. We will try to kidnap him and not let him go. He did his PhD in Minneapolis, Minnesota, some time ago. He has been a professor in Stanford, in Pompeo, in Rochester, and UCLA. He's an extremely eminent scholar. He has done fundamental contributions. He's a theorist, but he has done fundamental contributions in industrial organization, in macroeconomics, in development, and probably I leave things in description. He's extremely influential. He's one of the great economists alive. So we are extremely happy to have Hugo.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks for the introduction and the kind words too. So I hope, by the end of this talk, you have more questions than answers. And if the talk has helped you, think about new questions, I think, that will be success. If you end the talk with all the answers, I'll be disappointed. Part of this talk is also, in the context of your, career, the idea is, to show somehow some of the tools of economics and how they can be used to answer questions that are really pressing. And as I think, you're going to get convinced, are, some of the biggest questions that, you could ask in the world. Okay, so that's sort of an ambitious, what I'm going to present today is ambitious in terms of the context, perhaps not as ambitious in terms of the success in providing, satisfying answers about the context, but at least, pointing in some directions. So the name of the talk is Productivity of Nations. You've probably heard about The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's famous, book. And that's sort of the motivation of the title. So let me start, and I like to walk, but, at least I'm going to be here. You see some pictures in there that will be showing up over the time, and I'm sure you're curious about the last three and what do they have to do with the productivity of nations. First, here are some pictures. If you were an astronaut, you were traveling in the sky, this is what you would see at night from far away. This is Asia. And so you would see at night that there are a lot of lights in Asia. But then if you focus a little bit more on a particular country, this would be, do you guess which countries they are? Exactly, South Korea and North Korea. And so, this sort of illustrates that there are very big gaps in some ways as reflected by, the use of electricity and so on in development. This is Asia in 1992. So, just to contrast with it is now. So not only there is a lot of differences across countries as measured by light, but also there is change over time in the amount of light. So we'll start talking. The first picture is Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations. So this is just to illustrate the disparity of income per capita across the world. And somehow we're thinking about income per capita as a measure of wealth, or as a measure of in the terms utility of consumers or people that live in these countries. It might not be a perfect measure, but it's the best that we can come up with, and that is sort of uniform and comparable across countries. And you can see huge disparities. I'm not going to focus, exactly on each of the countries. You can pick your best, but the gap between, if you take the top 10% of countries and the bottom 10% of countries, the top in terms of income per capita is about 30 times. So this is kind of it's sort of a tremendous amount of inequality. Add to that the countries that are poorer are also countries with large populations. So when you think about the population that live in poverty, it's a very large fraction of the population of the world. So inequality is there, and inequality obviously also is within each of these countries. There's lots of inequality, and you're aware of that within Spain. But across the world, it's enormous. And so this is the big question: why, and what's behind this, and what explains this? So there's this big disparity. How has it evolved, and how do we explain that disparity? Are the questions. So in this presentation, I will focus on 3 or 4 things. One is the persistence of disparities in the world. So I'll document you that these disparities that we see now are very persistent. It's not that just give time to the countries that are less developed and they'll catch up. Yeah, that's not what's going on. And second, we're going to talk about the fundamental, and this is kind of the title of the talk, role of productivity, or the total factor of productivity, and connect the differences in productivity with something that, actually they asked me if I could link in some ways with firms, which has been, my basic research has been on the role of firms and the role of firms in explaining productivity and development. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, very popular today in thinking about institutions and the role of institutions, the role of policies, is distortions, the barriers to the allocation of resources across firms as a source of differences in productivity. Okay, so let me start. It's an ambitious talk in terms of time. I just hope not to crowd out too much of the time that has not been allocated to me. So first, I'm going to talk about the persistence of these disparities. Okay, so I've selected a few countries, but they're representative of the sort of the world in some ways in terms of the distribution. And this is from Madison Project Database from 1960 to 2030. And so you can see that sort of countries, a growth rate is here, the slope of the functions, that, there is not too much growth in the disparity across countries. They're sort of growing at the same rates, but not all are growing at the same rate. There's not all are equal. A good way of relabeling this is taking the output per capita of country in each of these periods and dividing it by the U.S. So you can see that the U.S. would be a line on one. It's not in here, but it would be a line on one. And these are the relatives relative to the U.S. So you could see, for instance, that Argentina, I'm from Argentina originally. Argentina is the blue one. It hasn't fared that well. It started, at a higher level than it is now. Most of the countries sort of maintain, but there are obviously, you can see Singapore, for instance, that, has sprung out. No? So there is no convergence in the sense that, it's not that the countries that are far behind are catching up. The disparities, if anything, actually have increased, not decreased across countries. But there are miracles and disasters. So you've seen the miracle of Singapore that went from being, 10% of the U.S. GDP per capita to being 20% over the GDP per capita of the U.S. currently. And then you can see Venezuela, on the other hand, that went, let's see, in 1975 was like 70% of the U.S. And it's now 15%. So there are miracles and disasters. And now come the cool thing. If you look at sports and you look at football, no, you will see also that there are miracles and disasters. So this is the average of 5-year sort of moving average of points in each league competition. And you can see there is similarities to what I showed you before. I mean, it's fanning out a little bit, but the main part is sort of constant. But there is, here we see that there is a miracle, which would be Atlético de Madrid, and that's who the miracle is. I should say, as an Argentinian, no, who is responsible for the miracle. And then Depor La Coruña, which is sort of going down. And so this is similar, and I just thought, was kind of curious of the similarities. If you look at actually the scoring, goles promedio quinquenal móvil, so the average 5 year moving average of goals, you can see that everything is sort of stable except for Barça in Real Madrid, and that's the effect, of course, of Ronaldo and Messi, no? Originally, I had only Messi in this graph, but I said, being in Madrid, I should put also Ronaldo. So there is persistence, and this shows you, comparing 1960 to 2018, the relative positions of the countries. So, for example, a country that is in the sort of 45-degree line would be a country that maintained its relative position above the 45-degree line, a country that improved the position below, a country that sort of got worse. And you can see that in some ways there's a lot of persistence in the relative positions. There are movements, in particular, there seem to be, this doesn't work, I think, okay, there seem to be more movement on the lower end, more persistence of the upper end of the distribution. But if anything, there's no convergence. It's not that the gap is closing. Similarly, if you look at the goals average, there seems to be persistence, and also, curiously, at the lower end, there seems to be, some reshuffling. This is my last connection with soccer in this talk. Okay, I'm sure we can learn a lot from soccer. I haven't gotten there yet, no, in terms of extrapolating from soccer what will happen in the world. So there is, just to summarize this, there's great dispersion of income per capita in the world. It's persistence. There's no convergence. The countries have grown at average rate, which is the world growth rate, the growth rate of the U.S., about 2% per year. But there are miracles and disasters. And there's something to learn from the miracles and the disasters. What did the miracles do right to grow so fast? What did the disasters do wrong to shrink so fast? Obviously, these are things that, are from the economics point of view, provide us with interesting natural experiments, if you want, for us to be able to study in detail. So how to explain this disparity? So here I'm going to use a little bit of economics and a little bit of microeconomics or macroeconomics. Where I learned in Minnesota, they were the same thing. So, can't distinguish between micro and macro. So basically, this is as an identity, the income divided by the population. So income per capita is income divided by employment times the ratio of employment over population. Maybe I should have employment, not horas trabajadas. There is a little bit of variation of employment, and then, maybe, developed countries are like maybe 20% higher in terms of employment per capita. On the other hand, there are many activities that people do that are productive and they're not registered in employment. So there's a lot of home production. Like if you take care of your babies at home and you cook at home, instead of going to a restaurant or having, taking your kids to a nursing school or nursery, then, you are doing production that is not measured. And so while if you were in a developed country and those things are done through the market, you would be measuring those activities. And so I wouldn't, that's sort of a caveat in thinking about employment over population as reflecting a good indicator. It is obviously good in explaining what we measure, but probably not as good in explaining what we omit and do not measure. Okay, so we're going to focus on the first term, which is the great majority of the dispersion comes from income per employment. And when we think about income per employment, we're thinking of income, which is a measure of output in some ways, divided by employment, which is an input. And so this suggests to us, or could suggest to us, a production function, that there's a connection between inputs and outputs. And so perhaps we can gain some insights into explaining the differences in income per capita or income per employee by looking at the differences in resources, how much is going into these production functions, right? And so here's a typical production function that is used in the literature for doing what is called a development accounting. K is going to be the capital. We're going to measure in some ways capital. L is going to be the total amount of employment, labor. H is the average human capital of the worker. Obviously there's a difference, and that's why you're here. You're acquiring human capital. You're going to be more productive than somebody that does not have your human capital, at least by measured by the wages that you're going to receive, right? And A is a residual, which in somehow measures, it's a bit of a residual in the sense that, it's what makes this equation hold. And we're going to call that the total factor of productivity. And so we're going to think of this as a productivity measure. And if we appropriately measure for each country, K, H, and L, would be able to back out what that productivity is, difference in productivity is. There's a more convenient, this is an exercise for after the talk. You can go from the above production function to the second line. The second line expresses output per worker, which is what we were looking at before, somehow output per capita. And it decomposes output per capita in three components. One is capital, the ratio of capital to output, to that coefficient alpha to 1 minus alpha. H, which is the average human capital in the society, and A, which is the productivity. Okay, and alpha here, 1 minus alpha, is the share of labor in total output. So labor share is approximately 2/3 in all countries. So that would mean that alpha over 1 minus alpha is about 1/2. So it's a square root of K over Y, empirically. So the idea is now we're going to be able to express the differences in income per capita in these three factors, right? And the ratio of capital output to the alpha over 1 minus alpha, human capital relative to the US, and we're going to measure all these relative to the US, using that benchmark comparison with the US. Okay, so just to give a sense of the importance of each of these, human capital is closely related to schooling, and that's the way that it's measured usually by economists. It's sort of some transformation of schooling, adjusting for the rates of return to schooling. And and this is sort of what we see in the data. These are bins of the smallest, the largest country in terms of schooling. These are average years of schooling. And then these are the lowest 10%, the upper 90%, etc. The ratio is about this is a typo. Okay. No, this is not schooling. This is the ratio of K over Y. Okay, so the ratio of K over Y, I should say that, is about 1.7. If you take the 90 to the 10%, it's 1.7. Years of schooling are here. They go from 1.4 in the lowest one to 14.3. I think that's Germany. The 90% is 12.8. The lower 10% in average is 4.6. The ratio there is 2.8. So it's considerably larger, the gaps that there are in schooling, than the gaps that we've seen in capital per capita. But gaps are not necessarily, just knowing the distribution and how much widely the distribution is, it's not necessarily as informative as how that correlates with what we want, which is income per capita, right? And so here we see is the correlations. The ratio of capital per output, it correlates in about like 14% with income per capita. Human capital correlates more, so it's more correlated, and there is more dispersion of it. It's more correlated. And productivity is this ignorance that we don't know about. It's very highly correlated. So the picture that emerges from this is, when we think about attributions, how can we explain, or the role that each of these three components have in explaining the income per capita? It's about The capital output ratio is about 14%, 22% to human capital, and 64% to productivity. This is huge. 64% is unexplained in some ways by the resources and doing this resource accounting. So this takes us to productivity and the title of this talk, which is the productivity of nations. As we saw in income per capita, there's also great dispersion in productivity across the world. Not surprisingly, because it accounts for so much, 64% of income per capita. If you take the top 10 versus the bottom 10, it's about 10 times. So there's a huge gap in productivity. And then the big questions come out, how do you explain it? And what can a country do to improve its productivity? So why is productivity so low in some countries and so high in others? This is a big question, and there's no chance that I'm going to be able to provide you answers. So I'm going to just show you windows, and some windows that are, have been explored in the literature and that seem promising as, potential sources of explanation. I'm going to connect to the role of firms and provide you a little bit of a view about the role that firms might have in resource side allocation. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about when we think about the aggregate productivity and we're thinking about an aggregate production function really doesn't exist. There's no aggregate firm that is producing that aggregate production function. There's a lot of firms, they're producing different products, they're producing with very different sizes. Some die, some are born. There's a huge dynamic. Some grow a lot, some shrink. So there is a lot of firms in the economy, and they're very different. But in some ways, the result of aggregate activity is the result of all these firms and the interaction between these firms and how resources are allocated to these firms. So when we think capital and labor, we saw before, capital labor translate into aggregate output through this aggregate TFP. That goes through firms, and it's firms that really might differ in productivity, and the allocation of resources across firms is what determines that. So I'm not going to be able to go in detail through this, but there is a way of relating. The second line here relates the aggregate productivity to three terms. Okay, one is the productivity of firms. So if you have more productive firms, if you've got better entrepreneurs and so on, your aggregate productivity will be higher, right? The other term is the number of firms. Turns out that the number of firms is important. It's a little bit more subtle how, the number of firms matter. But if you think of firms associated to products and, product variety is important, well, that will tell you that the number of firms will be also feed into aggregate productivity by offering you more alternatives. And the last one is the resource allocation. This says what fraction of the total capital and what fraction of the total labor is allocated to each firm. This is sort of an aggregator of that. Okay. So basically what you want is productive firms. You want, many of them. And at the same time, you want that the resources flow appropriately to the productive firms. Doesn't mean that the resources all have to go to the most productive firm, because then, they will not be able to use so much capital and labor. There's sort of decreasing returns, and that's captured in this formulation. But definitely there has to be a positive correlation between the productivity of a firm and the amount of resources it receives. So what explains the differences in productivity relating to firms? I'm going to concentrate on two. One is the quantity and quality of firms, and the other is the barriers to or distortions that do not allow resources to flow correctly to the right firms. Okay? So this is just, one little thing. I'm going to focus on just reference of a paper that examined in Portugal the link between education, the education of the entrepreneur, and the quality of the firm. And the quality here is going to be measured by the sales of the firms. And so there are two features here. And here we go from the blue corresponds to an entrepreneur with 0 to 6 years of education. On the other extreme, the diamond reflects somebody with graduate education. And so you can see that these lines obviously are, on top of each other. And so they reflect the fact that a better entrepreneur can produce more and grows faster over time. So if you compare a firm created by an entrepreneur with more than 15 years of schooling versus one with 6 years of schooling, they will be 39% bigger when they're born initially, and 2.7 times the size at 10 years after. Okay, so this tells you more educated entrepreneurs, will be able to manage better firms and firms that grow more. Okay, so that's if you sort of factor this in and say, well, this is going to affect the quality. Now we have a link that remember the AIs that we had there, which were the qualities of the firms, the productivity of the firms, is kind of be related to schooling also. And so this gives us another channel by which human capital affects productivity as affecting the quality of the entrepreneurs. And this actually, once you include this doubles the size, the importance. Remember, we said it was about 22% before, to about 44%, the role of human capital or differences in human capital, education, and so on across the world. Finally, we're going to focus on barriers and distortions. So why your resources, capital, and labor doesn't flow to the high productivity firms as it should. That's sort of and I'm going to focus on some barriers and distortions that have been emphasized in the literature. There are many types of distortions. There's distortions that affect the returns to firms. Taxation, could be progressive taxation, for example, which has a good reason to exist, but has also potentially consequences as creating wedges in the assignment of resources across firms. Restrictions to reallocation. I studied in a paper the role of layoff cost. And layoff cost, in fact, this was a long time ago. I was at Pompeu Fabra, and unemployment rate in Spain in the 90s was like 21%. And there was no hiring, very little firing, and very little turnover. And a lot of it was blamed to the very high firing cost. And so it was very hard for firms to adjust their labor force. If they hire somebody, they would have to anticipate that if they needed to fire them, they would have to pay very high wages. Not to say that might be important from the point of view of social protection, but obviously it creates a wedge in the adjustment of firms, and firms are going to adjust less with those. There could be barriers to entry and exit of firms. Some countries have very huge barriers to entry, the creation of firms, and very high cost of creating firms. Maybe you have to wait even for like a year or two in the bureaucracy, going through all the red tape and able to create a firms. There are barriers to the growth of firms, access to markets, access to capital, access to resources, access to financing. There might be difficulties in contracting, the law enforcement, and law might not be enforced. And when contracts are not enforced, there's an issue with credibility and whether you trust or not, your partner. Or maybe instead of using your best input, you use your friends because you know they're going to be more reliable. So that also creates a wedge. And finally, market power and markups, which has been received a lot of attention recently, could play also a very important role. Okay, so I'm just going to focus on the effects of these barriers. Could be getting the wrong selection of firms. It's not maybe the best entrepreneurs that we have, but the ones that are able to move themselves through all the red tape and all the channels, maybe have money or resources and are able to do that. And then distortions, the allocation of resources. And the third one I am not going to be able to cover. Okay, so the first one is restrictions to credit. As you can see, rejected for a loan application. This is not, not only in The Simpsons, but, in the real world. If you look at a measure of how much credit firms are getting, is the ratio of total credit in the economy divided by GDP. So take all credit divided by the GDP. In developed countries, the average is about 116%. Other emerging, 48%. Latin America, 45%. Argentina, where I'm from, really very, very low. I mean, there's almost no capital market. Okay, so you can see that there's very different access to credit across the world. What does this affect? This is going to have the effect at first. Who are going to be entrepreneurs? Well, if there's no credit, entrepreneurs are going to be selected adversely in the sense that they're going to be selected to be the ones that are richer. Not necessarily the best entrepreneurs, but the ones that have financial resources. Second, it's not only the question of who becomes an entrepreneur, so the mix of entrepreneurs could be wrong, but also the allocation of resources to those entrepreneurs could be wrong because it's going to be driven to some extent by access to credit or by access to wealth. Okay, so there's a famous paper, Buera-Kabowski-Shin. If you want references, I can give you references after that. And they, within the context of a sort of model, I mean, it's using economic models and at the same time using data to assign sort of parameters to those models. They sort of concluded, this is a table from them, that if you take financial development of a country, right, country that has 10% credit over GDP, would lose about 35% of productivity because of the fact that you would get the wrong entrepreneurs. A country that has 50%, 30, and so on, a country that has, twice the credit to the, than GDP, basically would not lose anything. Credit would be so widely available that entrepreneurship would be dictated by efficiency, by quality of entrepreneurs, and not by means. Distortions is the other one. I think you can see that there is a misallocation here. No, who should be riding which bike? That's what distortions mean. That resources are not allocated correctly. Here it's clear that who should be using the big bike and the small one. So I'm going to talk about two types of distortions. In a longer talk, I would have mentioned the other ones. One is taxes and exemptions that generate distortions, and credit restrictions. Again. This is for France. France has, if you are a firm with less than 50 employees, you qualify, for basically you pay less of labor taxes. Okay. So what you can see here is there's a bunching of firms exactly at 50, right? So they're firms that are really kind of holding their size just to be able to qualify for that, right? And you can see that drop that there is after that. So there is a big effect of these distortions in terms of the decisions that firms have of, the right mix of resources to use. I'm not going to go in details of what this implies in terms of, the loss of output. The existing calculations are not very, meaningful, but not meaningful. They're not, they don't show that there's a lot from that. But anyway, this is a kind of distortion. And like this distortion, many of the underdeveloped countries have huge fraction of their labor force in what is called informal markets, informal firms. That is, firms are not paying taxes, that are not paying, Social Security, that are not paying vacations, a bunch of things, right? In Argentina, it's about 50% of the employees do not get, are essentially informal and have these informal contracts. And informal contracts can have big effects. Maybe, there's not going to be as much accumulation of human capital, the firms are not going to invest as much in the workers, and so on. There are many consequences that might affect, the productivity of firms. So that's one. And finally, the last one is, what are the resources which the entrepreneurs have? So we saw that lack of credit could lead to the wrong mix of entrepreneurs, but it also can lead to entrepreneurs not being able to get the resources that they should get given their productivity or the value of their firms. And these are, again, taking financial development, 10%, 50%, 1, 2. These are the losses from that. They are substantial, 22%, 13%, 10, 3. At least, from the scope of this paper, it seems that, the role of the misallocation of talent in production dominates the misallocation of resources to talent. But it's still, these are really big numbers. Now, these are suggestive. And if you start adding numbers, you're going to say, wait, are we explaining more than 100% than the differences in productivity? Probably if you start adding these numbers, I told you, twice the role for human capital. Now you take the quality of entrepreneurs. I told you 35% or, like 35% coming from this anti-natural selection, 22%. By the way, Darwin was in the first pictures, if you saw him. There's a lot of selection in who become firms and natural selection of surviving firms that I'm not going to get into, but that was why that picture was there. So you might see, this adds to more than what it adds to explain. So there's no puzzle to explain. In fact, we are over-explaining, the puzzle. Of course, these things are all connected and related. A country that has poor, schooling is correlated also with being a country that has, financial constraints. It's also been a country that has, poor firms and so on. I mean, there's many connections between all these. And perhaps also the lack of schooling, good schooling of the country, is the result of the country's productivity being very low. And so the quality of the schools, I mean, if the country is bad at producing goods, it's also probably bad at producing human capital. And so that quality also is affecting the quality of human capital. So it's really hard to get a picture that, a perfect accounting in which we separate exactly what are the factors. I think, what this literature points to you is there are some things that seem to matter a lot. And there are, these are things we should be focusing on. So just to summarize, there's great disparity in income per capita across the world. We've emphasized the importance of human capital. And I think the literature is going in that direction, saying human capital is even, much more important than we actually think it is. But what emerges as a central factor is aggregate productivity, or TFP, total factor productivity. This is affected by technology in use, the capital, what we call firm capital or capital empresario, and the allocation of resources to firms. And I'm just going to stop there. We talked about barriers. Barriers to a sort of to the right allocation of resources across firms as a dominant force, and this is sort of also where the literature is going. All right.
What can countries do, or in the case of Singapore, what did they do to become that miracle?
I knew that was coming. Okay, so I think from here you can get some lessons that what countries can do, and Singapore did a lot of these things. One is there is obviously creating opportunities for firms to be created and for the firm capital to be developed. Second, in the case of many countries like Singapore, that these tigers that grew so fast, there have been also very active policies in subsidizing and creating this firm capital, and so providing the resources so that the firms can grow, develop, and they can develop some comparative advantages that can be exploited and become a source of growth. There's also been a huge increase in human capital, investment in education and human capital. This is going on also in China. I mean, China is also one of these countries. It's now maybe in the ratio of like 30% of the US, but it started fairly recently in 95, let's say, as less than 10% of the US. So it's another country of high growth, and there's been huge investments in education, huge investments in infrastructure, and giving the possibility of market economies emerging. Credit also plays a role in the availability of credit for firms. It has also been a source in these countries too. I'm more of a theorist, so that pushes me to the limits, in terms of I haven't focused so much on understanding cases, and taking an approach and thinking about cases. But I think you're asking the right question, and and this is something, understanding that and is really important. The other thing is that, is it possible for every country to do this, or in some ways do some countries crowd out others? So there's evidence now, for example, that I haven't talked about a lot of the process of development involves transition from going from being an agricultural country to sort of more manufacturing and more services in more advanced economies. And there's some recent evidence that, poor countries that are trying to do that transition cannot make it into manufacturing and sort of are moving directly more into services. And perhaps it has to do with the fact that, it's very hard now to compete with manufacturing, with China, countries that have been, so productive and have very low wages. And so that, their costs of production are very low. Aside from Trump's arguments that you could say that they're subsidizing their exports, regardless of those considerations. Does that help? Okay. Perhaps, what I should tell you is, here's a good project. If you're motivated and interested. It's more raising questions than answers. So, yeah.
Yes. I mean, I have two questions. First, it's both related to human capital, and it's one of them. Right now, the AI is rising, and why would countries focus on human capital while they can use machines in their fabrics or in anywhere in work? And also, again, human capital is important, but when we look in world, most of the countries who are successful economically or who countries have stable economies are like with less population countries compared to like, I don't know, India or Pakistan, or if you say China, maybe. Like, why it's important to human capital when it's like this in the world?
I mean, people could have said the same in the Industrial Revolution, right? Why, focus on whatever education? Why do we want all this if machines are going to be doing everything? No, and in fact, the returns to education actually increased, not decreased, with the Industrial Revolution. I think, we know so little about AI. I tried to translate this, by the way, to English with AI, and it wasn't very successful. But on the other hand, I've used AI in very successful ways, as Siri knows. So I'm not sure that it's. I think there's going to be always jobs. It's just there are going to be different kind of jobs. Perhaps maybe the right question would be, over the last 20 years, or just to give you a context, or maybe 30 years, the premium to skills has increased. That is, the ratio of wages from, highly educated to less educated people has risen, that gap. People attribute that to what they call skill bias technological change, that there's been technological change, call it maybe computers or automation or whatever, that have sort of increased the returns to skill relative to no skills, and so contribute to creating that gap. So perhaps the question, and I'm not ready to answer that question, and there's need for data, and I think it's too early to answer that question, is, will AI enhance or, compensate for that skill gap? So will the skill premium decrease as a consequence of AI or actually increase? I think there is some evidence that in some range, it's generating huge returns to skills, which are the people that are really on the frontier of working in AI, sort of computer science at the frontier. You read it all the time, no? The wages that they're getting, the compensation that these people are getting to run companies in AI. Now, this is a really small fraction of the population, no? So we can't make inferences, based on that. But it is possible that AI will have a nonlinear effect on the skill premium that might increase the skill premium at a very high end, but flatten the skill premium at a lower end, in which case it might be that the returns to education are not going to be as high, or are going to be very high, but, for just, very high levels of education. And so it might have, as I'm saying, depending on which of the forces predominates, it might have an effect of dampening the impact of differences in human capital in explaining these differences in income per capita, or not, or the opposite. So I think, again, I'm happy you asked, because I think that is a good question. And that's something definitely that a lot of researchers are thinking about. Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned taxation as a factor that can prevent countries from developing or creating new companies, but obviously taxes are necessary for everything, basically. So what would you say it's a country that is a good example of balance between entrepreneurial activity and taxes?
Obviously, yeah, taxation is important, and there's a whole field in sort of economics and public finance that is considering the question of optimal taxation, and sort of taxes are in general distortive. Taxes are wedges, and they're sort of somebody has to pay it, somebody doesn't, and so it encourages the one that doesn't pay to grow, and the one that has to pay it to not grow. But taxes have to be in some way collected. No, you're right about that. And so I think, we are getting some insights into things that are very costly, and taxes that, can be very costly. And so what we need to learn is what kinds of taxation are really, harming the economy more. For example, one of the things that emerges from the literature is that there's these very big disparities in the cost of entry and the cost of creating firms have very big consequences in terms of, the aggregate productivity. And so perhaps, that's something, countries should try to soften, the conditions for firms to be created. And there are big taxes associated with that. There taxes that affect, the reallocation of resources across firms have also been seen to be fairly damaging. So I don't know. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, taxation is unavoidable. The question is trying to get, more knowledge into what are the taxes that contribute, more to creating, gaps on productivity, and taxes that are less harming in that sense.
Okay, first of all, thank you for being here today. And my question is based on the first part of your conference. Whenever someone talks about inequality, it always reminds me of two major principles in economic terms, which are basically freedom and equality. And I think that these two principles are collapsing in Occident. So from my perspective, economic liberalism based economies overestimate wealth and underestimate social welfare. So, which in other terms means that freedom is prioritized against equality. So my question is, don't you think that liberalism always brings together an intrinsic consequence, which is inequality? And if this is true, there would be a clear formula, which is the higher the productivity of a country, the higher the inequality. So in order to achieve less inequality, shouldn't a country give up some productivity? Thank you.
So I can answer with my head or with my heart. My heart has always been with you, on the side of fighting against inequality. I think again, I agree. There's trade-offs, right? I mean, one of the things that you see, coming to Spain, the access to public goods and the fact that public goods are available, widely available. I think that's something that, you don't see in the US. I mean, in the US, you see fairly high taxation, and yet, there's very little in terms of public goods. I kind of like the idea of, being able to provide some basic public goods that are very important in affecting some needs that are, when you talk about inequality, that are very pressing and that make the lives of people really bad. And so thinking about health, right? In the US, health is very costly. The access to health is very unequal. I think here is much more even in that sense. And while you might say there's less freedom in the sense that there's a bigger government, or the size of the government is bigger, I think at least if the government is providing these public goods, I think that's useful. On the other hand, the process of development, is hard to think of development occurring without generating some inequality. And so you have to find ways of sort of mitigating the inequality that occurs. When a country, for example, my experience in Argentina in the 90s, Argentina in the 90s liberalized the economy, opened the economy a lot, eliminated tariff barriers. And as a consequence of that, there was a lot of firms that, collapsed. They also privatized a lot of companies, and so reduced the size of the public sector. Unemployment rates went to like 21%, and there were no unemployment insurance mechanisms available, and so there was no, the country was not prepared for mitigating the inequality that is generated. Anytime there's change, there's going to be inequality. There's losers, gains, people that gain and people that lose. And so if you want some change and you want some progress, there are going to be forces that generate inequality. And the question there is, how can you mitigate through policies those forces?
Well,
I think we need to, in
yes.
the sake of time, I think there are other questions or not. Are there any other questions? Yeah, we can talk after. Okay. I mean, you're pressing something really important.
Yeah. You said that availability of credit improves productivity, but do you think that also too much credit might unstabilize the economy and maybe put at risk the financial markets?
Okay, so the question is, too much credit might lead to, if there's so much credit and it's so cheap, I'm going to create firms, and I'm a really bad entrepreneur. I mean, the only case I created one firm, which was a coffee place, just failed dramatically. I mean, I'm really bad entrepreneur. But, if they're going to give me for free credit, I'll do it, Of course, too much credit in that sense can create. On the other hand, instability, there are other channels. I mean, maybe extending too much credit could lead to vulnerabilities in the banking system, which I don't know about. I mean, I'm not an expert on that. And so there could lead to financial crisis and that sort of instability. But of course, I mean, you don't want to give out, money. And there's reasons why when people talk about financial constraints, right? You see all these financial constraints in countries. You say, should be easy. The government should just step in and give money to firms, right? But then you have to think more deeply. Why are there financial constraints? And perhaps there are financial constraints because the legal system to enforce contracts is not good, because there's very poor information or very asymmetric information between lenders and borrowers that leads to sort of the kind of, impossibility of trade. So you gotta have to think about, not just think about, okay, there's financial constraints, period. Okay, we have to relax them. That's it. And that's the panacea. No, you have to go deeper in saying what is behind those financial constraints. And if you try to relax things that exist for some reason, it might be responding in terms of the way the economy is organized itself in I would say maybe not totally appropriately, but in some ways it's an adjustment that the banking system made to the information it has. Just driving against that might not be the best thing. So you have to go deeper and understand the sources of financial constraints.
Well, I think that we are about time. Thank you very much. And if you want to add things to go.
And I'm on campus. I mean,
Well, they cannot come to the office.
but you can come to the outside. But you can.